Hello and welcome. It's going to take us a little bit of time for everybody to enter. We're really glad that you're here. This webinar focuses on AEP, dark money, and House Bill 6. And we're really blessed to have a bunch of experts here to guide us through kind of the intricate web of dark money and, let's face it, utility policy, which can be a little bit complicated. So I did want to start out just welcoming you all. It'll take a little bit of time before everyone gets here. I'm Kathiann from Common Cause, Ohio, and I'm really glad that you all are here today to learn a little bit more about dark money. One of the things that's really clear to me is I care a lot about dark money, and it's not just because I'm nosy, but it's because I am actually nosy, but it's not just because I'm nosy, it's because I care about accountability and I want to understand what is happening behind the scenes. I want to understand what's influencing elections and what's influencing public policy. And so welcome everybody. Hopefully you have all entered and we're glad that you're here today. Once again, I'm Kathiann from Common Cause, Ohio. I'd just like to say thank you to our co-sponsors. So we have the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance, the Energy and Policy Institute, Ohio Citizen Action, the Ohio Environmental Council, and the Sierra Club. And with that, what I'd like to do is move us along. I'm going to start by introducing you all to our moderator. Now, our moderator is Morgan Trau. She is an award-winning State House journalist. She reports for WEWS, so that's in Cleveland. She reports for WCPO 9, so that's in Cincinnati. And then, many times you'll see her online on the Ohio Capitol Journal. So I encourage you all to check out her reporting. She does some really interesting deep dives into all the different hot topics at the State House. And so I would encourage you to move beyond just the dark money, but to think about what else she's up to. Now, she was born and raised in the Cleveland suburbs. I don't know whether it's the east side or the west side, so we'll have to ask her. Now, this highlights that you will see there's a Q&A area, question and answer area, and there's also a chat. So, if you have a question, you can throw it in there. You can also throw questions in the chat. So either place is good, but if you want to have something kind of quickly answered, throw it into the Q&A. I'd also like to encourage you all, there are about 88 of us that are on this webinar right now. Please throw your name in and where you're from. And that way Morgan will have a sense of who actually is part of this webinar. Now, I'd also like to highlight this about Morgan. She attended the Syracuse University Newhouse School, that prestigious journalism school, and she's also done reporting for other states. So Michigan, basically where Washington State and Idaho meet, and also in New York State. So she has a sense of what's it like in other states as well. And with that, Morgan, I'm handing this off to you, and thank you for guiding us through this discussion.
Kathiann, that was such a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. We're going to have a lot to talk about. As she said, I'm Morgan. I have the great pleasure of, being around all of these people all the time, but these especially two incredible panelists here. There are two people that know about energy policy in the state. It is Kathiann Kowalski and Dave Anderson. So Kathiann Kowalski, Kathy, is a journalist, author, lawyer, specializing in the environment, in science, and in policy. You'll find her work in all types of environment news organizations, all the way from local to international, and in places like the Ohio Capitol Journal. She is the author of 25 books and hundreds of articles, with many in Energy News Network. And then Dave is the Policy and Communications Manager for Energy and Policy Institute, which is a pro-clean energy utility watchdog group. Dave has been researching the influence of utility and fossil fuel interests on energy and climate change policies for over a decade. Dave's research has helped to spur public scrutiny of political attacks on clean energy and climate science by electric utilities, including FirstEnergy and AEP we're talking about today. And both of them also helped lead coverage and investigations into House Bill 6. Now, what we're going to be talking about is really complex, as Kathiann said. So at any time, please put questions in the Q&A box. We're going to be taking some at the end, or we're going to be answering them as we go. But as you sit and you watch this forum, I see a lot of you are from Ohio. So as you sit and watch it from your home in Ohio, you are subsidizing 2 coal plants, one that is not even in this state. You may ask yourself, why? Well, that answer lies within the 133rd General Assembly. A now convicted felon named Larry Householder was the Speaker of the House. In a scheme we will get more into depth into later, Householder took a $61 million bribe from First Energy and other companies in exchange for a $1.3 billion bailout. He and former GOP leader Matt Borges were found guilty a couple months ago in a racketeering scheme, one to help failing nuclear power plants on the taxpayers' dime. So although they weren't at the epicenter of the trial, AEP, who is American Electric Power, they benefited greatly from the criminal activity. AEP is based in Ohio, and they might be your provider. They serve 1.5 million customers, and they have nearly 10 billion in assets. You may be asking yourself, how does a corporation or multiple corporations donate millions of dollars to influence political figures, and it wasn't found out immediately? Well, that is because of dark money, which we're talking about today. So let's bring it to Kathiann. What is dark money?
Thanks. So I'm going to be explaining dark money today using some of my daughter's toys. And campaign finance laws generally impose limits on how much individuals or political action committees can give to candidates. And there are rules that require periodic disclosures about how much is given and who is giving it and what happens to the money. And the reason for that is, as Kathiann says, accountability. You want to know who's backing someone or who's fighting against them. So dark money refers to funds to influence the political process where we don't have that clear paper trail. Court decisions have allowed a limited dark money spending as long as a group's activities are independent of a candidate or the candidate's campaign. And very often, if we move forward, Kathiann, if you can move forward. Okay, very often you may look at these groups and they can look like independent nonprofits. They may have, very benign sounding names, things like Generation Now, or the Coalition for Growth and Opportunity, or Hardworking Ohioans, or even Empowering Ohio's Economy, right? But if you could look who's backing some of those groups, you'd be surprised. And again, I've said we can't figure this out, but we get some clues from Internal Revenue Service reports that are filed. They may show, for example, that a grant went from one group to another group. Or they may show that, spending went, here or there and what was going on, right? So what turned out to be the case in the House Bill 6 trial that took place this winter was there was a lot of evidence showing a lot of coordination between Larry Householder on the one hand and Generation Now, the main dark money group, but also a number of other dark money groups, and not just by Householder, but by other central players in the drama, right? And because that was all hidden, we didn't find out about a lot of it until way after Householder, Borges, and others were arrested in 2020. And even then, we didn't get full information until some that came out in the trial. Also, the government was busy making its case against Larry Householder and Matt Borges, so it wasn't digging deep into a lot of the other evidence that was being presented, where you might see American Electric Power's name here, or Empowering Ohio's Economy name there, or different things. And as a journalist, I'm sitting there going, wait, go back. I want to see that some more. So the upshot, if you advance, is, we got some information, but that came nearly 3 years after the July 2020 arrest. And meanwhile, voters lacked information that could have swayed them for the governor's election in 2022 and for 2 elections for the Ohio legislature. So that's a brief introduction to dark money with nesting dolls. And I'll turn it back to Morgan.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Tell me, do you think that Ohio is susceptible to fraud because of our campaign laws?
Oh, yes, definitely. And the reason is, if you can hide what's going on, there isn't accountability. And if there isn't accountability, people feel that, they can go ahead and make deals with impunity. And in fact, during the trial, we heard lawyers for Borges and Householder both argue, this is business as usual. This is how things are done. And, that may be how things are done, but as the verdict showed, it can also be a corrupt way to do things.
And you're mentioning House Bill 6 in the trial from a couple months ago. Dave, you know everything about this trial in House Bill 6. Tell me, what is House Bill 6?
Happy to. Dave Anderson from the Energy and Policy Institute here. If you could go to the next slide. So House Bill 6 in many ways was a continuation of some earlier efforts by the electric utilities, including First Energy in Ohio, to roll back clean energy standards for utilities that the state had adopted with really strong bipartisan support in 2008. And then also on First Energy's part, to secure ratepayer bailouts for some of its nuclear and coal plants in the state of Ohio from ratepayers. And then on the part of AEP and several other utilities that are co-owners of this thing called the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation, to secure ratepayer bailouts for coal plants that are owned by this entity that's often referred to as OVEC for short. So you kind of had all of these proposals that have been floating around for a number of years and had failed, packaged into this super, frankly, awful bill that was pretty detrimental to ratepayers. And apparently what was required to make this thing Ohio law was a $60 million bribery scheme, as we'll see moving forward. But then one quick thing to note would be that as a result of the federal investigation into Larry Householder and his associates in First Energy, some parts of the bill have been repealed, namely the nuclear bailout, and then another provision that effectively handed First Energy $700 million in guaranteed earnings paid for by ratepayers were repealed. And then the OVEC bailout and the rollback of Ohio's clean energy standards remain law today, despite that federal investigation. So if you look here, this is a useful infographic that was put together after Larry Householder's arrest in 2020 by the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEPA. And it basically just maps out in a somewhat easy to follow way, although it really demonstrates how complicated the scheme was. The passage of money from up top company A, which is First Energy, and A1, which is his former subsidiary First Energy Solutions, through this network of for-profit entities and nonprofit 501c4 organizations. And the purpose of that was essentially to conceal First Energy as the source of the $60 million in what prosecutors now call bribe payments, and a jury has now concluded that that was an accurate description to this network of individuals and organizations and firms that formed the Householder racketeering enterprise. Next slide. This slide was used by prosecutors when they announced the arrest of Householder in 2020. And basically it not only follows the flow of money from Company A, which is First Energy, and a 501c4 at Control called Partner for Progress, into the entities that form the Householder enterprise, but also gets to how the money was spent. So early on in 2017, 2018, some of the money from First Energy was spent to help elect what were called team householder candidates. And these were basically candidates for the Ohio House that would later support Larry Householder in his bid to return as Ohio House Speaker, which eventually happened in early 2019. He had actually served as House Speaker previously in the 2000s and left both due to term limits and an initial federal investigation that didn't result in charges. So kind of a weird anecdote there that they probably could have seen what they were going to get from his past leaving of Columbus and scandal, but chose to pump all this money into bringing him back to the job anyways. Householder also used some of the money for his personal benefit. So that included some of the money that was used to settle a lawsuit involving a failed coal mine that he was a part owner of in Alabama, and then other personal uses like maintenance and renovations on a home in Florida that he then sold for a profit. So that's kind of a unique part of this case. And then other money was used to support the passage of House Bill 6 and defeat a referendum that could have repealed it through voters, but that never reached the ballot. So here, it just wanted to compare on the next few slides how First Energy funneled money into the Householder enterprise. I mentioned earlier that paid about $25 million to a 501c4 organization called Partners for Progress that was both controlled by First Energy and received $25 million from that utility company. And of that money, over 14 million went to 501c4s associated with Householder, Generation Now, and the Coalition for Growth and Opportunity, for example. You can go to the next slide. And here you can see that American Electric Power did something very similar. They have a 501c4 called Empowering Ohio's Economy that their now former VP of External Affairs, Tom Frohl, served as a director on that nonprofit. They paid $8.7 million into it over the course of a few years. And then a good chunk of that money went to several 501c4 organizations associated with Larry Householder. So again, the purpose of that appears to be to conceal AEP as the source of the money. And really before the federal investigation became public, no one really knew that these entities existed or that they were associated with the electric utilities that funded them. Here you can see there is a lot of money that flowed from First Energy into other 501c4s that weren't necessarily directly mentioned or implicated in the Householder case. A few examples here would be Generation Atomic, which was a weird supposed millennials group that was supporting earlier bills aimed at bailing out First Energy's nuclear plants in Ohio. And then Securing Ohio's Future was a 501c4 that supported Mike DeWine for governor in Ohio. And Consumers Against Deceptive Fees may be familiar to any Clevelanders on the webinar because it, for a few years, engaged in attacks on Cleveland public power, basically as part of a long-term campaign to try to get rid of that public utility and replace it with Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company, which is First Energy's utility in Cleveland. Go to the next slide. And then similarly, we see a lot of money flowed from American Electric Power through this Empowering Ohio's Economy group to other groups. One of them, interestingly, is called Open Road Path. Basically, after Householder's arrest, a lot of the money that was still in Empowering Ohio's Economy account was shifted over to this new 501c4 organization that was formed with essentially the same leadership. So as far as we know, they're still sitting on a bankroll of $3 million dollars that they could spend at any given time to influence politics further. And then they also spent quite a bit of money to bring the GOP convention to Cleveland in 2016. And then looking down, State Solutions Inc. is another 501c4 associated with the Republican Governors Association that spent money to help elect Governor DeWine in 2018. Just a couple other quick ones. Two Paths America is a 501c4 associated with John Kasich and has run for president and other efforts since then. And then the Rule of Law Defense Fund is a group that is associated with the Republican Attorney General's Association. So you can see how there's these myriad 501c4s associated with different public policy makers and how utilities have been using these dark money groups to fund money and gain influence with them. Next slide. This is actually a slide that the prosecutors shared with the jury during Householder's trial. So you can see it's pretty heavy on co-conspirators and Mr. Householder himself, who have been convicted or pleaded guilty, and then some other uncharged associates of the Householder enterprise listed down below. And then on the right, a lot of current and former executives and lobbyists for First Energy and its former subsidiary First Energy Solutions, which is now a new company called Energy Harbor, which for whatever reason has chosen to stick with the leaders who got up in this massive bribery scheme, whereas First Energy itself has fired quite a few people who were or at the forefront of that effort. You can go to the next slide. So one of the Householder co-conspirators who was found guilty by the jury, actually during the same trial that led to the conviction of Larry Householder, was Matthew Borges. So he was a political consultant, lobbyist, and also the former head of the Ohio Republican Party. Something that came out during the trial was some new details about his work, not only for First Energy, but for AEP during the time frame of the House Bill 6 bribery scheme. So he was getting monthly checks for between $2,500 to $10,000 from AEP during this time, and seemed to also be working on some of the same issues that he was working on for First Energy in terms of bailouts for the utility companies. You can go to the next page. So here, just a few examples of how AEP itself has responded to the investigation and scandal surrounding it. It's kind of vacillated depending on who's speaking for them, between approaching the whole issue as nothing to see here, in terms of AEP actually being involved in any wrongdoing, and these 501c4 payments being not a big deal and something that was kind of out of their control once the money left their bank account, to Nick Akins, who throughout the time frame of the House Bill 6 investigation was the CEO of AEP and is still the utility company's executive chairman, saying it was certainly a tainted process and it made all the utilities look bad. So take that for what it is. Go to the next slide. And these are some of the individuals who were mentioned by prosecutors and even the defense during the Householder trial, or in exhibits of evidence that prosecutors submitted for use in the Householder trial. I mentioned Nick Akins stepped down somewhat early as CEO, but remains an influence at the utility as the board executive chairman. This fellow Thomas Frohl, who was involved in the Empowering Ohio's Economy group, retired with praise from the utility company in 2021. And then his colleague Maria Haberman is still lobbying for AEP, and this outside attorney who's really good friends with the DeWine family also worked on Empowering Ohio's Economy, and a couple other 501c4s associated with AEP is still around and very involved in Ohio politics. You can go to the next screen. So one of the weird things about AEP's response to this whole investigation and scandal when compared to First Energy is it's really tried to distance itself from what happened to the money it paid to this dark money group empowering Ohio's economy. I had reached out for a blog post I was writing a few years ago and asked, hey, what's up with this $200,000 that AEP gave, or that Empowering Ohio's Economy gave to this group associated with Larry Householder Coalition for Growth and Opportunity in 2017. And they just responded saying, oh, you need to ask Empowering Ohio's Economy, not really addressing the fact it was all AEP money to begin with. So as a result of the trial and some public records requests that I filed today, we can see that literally on the same day that some money from AEP's 501c4 Empowering Ohio's Economy landed in this Coalition for Growth and Opportunities bank account in October of 2017, you have this lobbyist for AEP, Maria Haberman, emailing the audio of an ad supporting an OVEC bailout bill that had been introduced that year by the same group, the Coalition for Growth and Opportunity. So the idea that somehow AEP wasn't involved in coordinating these 501c4 payments and money flowing in between these groups is pretty absurd based on the documents. This is just some more evidence that was made public through the trial and public records requests. Basically, we can see copies of all the checks that AEP's 501c4 wrote to dark money groups associated with Larry Householder and the dates those were paid. You can go to the next slide. And one of the more notable ones was from early April 2019, right around the time House Bill 6 was introduced for $250,000. It's the largest single payment to Generation Now from this AEP 501c4. And a few days before, you had Tom Frohl and others from AEP involved in a meeting about legislation with somebody at the email address bluesuedeloafers@gmail.com, who prosecutors revealed is Larry Householder. I'm not really sure what the Blue Suede Loafer is all about, but love to hear that story. Next slide. And then final example, during the trial, there was a top political advisor for Larry Householder named Jeff Longstruth, who had pleaded guilty in the case early on. And then he turned into a witness for the prosecution. And he detailed how after House Bill 6 passed, the Householder team was intending to introduce a new ballot initiative that would have weakened Ohio's term limits law to enable Larry Householder to remain in the State House and likely Speaker for another 16 years beyond what current Ohio law would have allowed. So probably basically the most of his career, remaining life and career, given his age. And Longstruth testified about how Nick Akins, the then CEO of AEP, met with Householder and along with some AEP lobbyists, heard about this term limits initiative and said, that sounds great, and then a short time later, we can see from federal tax filings and from bank statements that were revealed in the trial, AEP's 501c4 donated $500,000 to this effort called the Coalition for Term Limits. So that never really got off the ground due to COVID and Householder's arrest, but AEP had committed beyond that to provide, I think it was a total of $2 million to support this term limits initiative. So seems like the more and more we learn from the trials and ongoing federal investigation, the more details and the more money emerges. And I'm pretty sure we haven't seen the end of this thing yet as far as AEP is involved.
And yeah, talking about AEP being involved beyond 501c4s and dark money, how else does, or I guess could, AEP use money to influence lawmakers?
Yeah, so I think one important thing to note is the stuff that we've gone through in these slides is really just money that passed, from utilities like First Energy to AEP through these 501c4 groups that they funded. But utilities can also directly give money, more directly give money through their political action committees, which was certainly the case with AEP and Larry Householder. And then also through other entities that have been formed through election laws like 527 groups. So for example, AEP gave $600,000 to the Republican Governors Association just last year. And that's one group. So it kind of shows you that when you combine all these different pots of monies and ways that they can donate to influence politics, really starts to pile up into many millions of dollars. And for utilities, they're kind of unique because it also raises the question of where is this money coming from? Was it, collected from ratepayers through utility bills?
And I'm seeing a lot of really great questions all about how this impacts the consumer. So Kathy, do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on with AEP right now and how that would impact people's wallets?
Sure. Basically, all customers of regulated utilities in Ohio remain on the hook for the old plant's business risks. They also miss out on any benefits they might have been getting from the renewable energy standards or the energy efficiency standards. On balance, for all of the utilities customers, they have paid more for the OVEC plants, the two 1950s era coal plants, than they've gotten back from any rebates. So what I did here on this slide is basically collect information that AEP's spokesperson gave me about what the charges or credits had been from 2020 through the first half of this year. He said they don't yet know what it'll be for the second half of this year. And then as we move beyond that, critics say the costs are most likely going to rise even more. One factor is higher prices on the world market for both coal and natural gas. And that's actually driving utility, both AEP and First Energy's basically non-shopping customers rate increases already, but the OVEC plants are going to be subject to that too when it comes to higher prices for coal. There also are going to be more regulatory requirements coming in, such as cleaning up old coal ponds on property, or if the EPA's new proposed rules for power plants become law, then those would apply. And of course, we still have the war in Ukraine going on, and we have a bottleneck for getting more energy, more electricity on the grid through PJM, which is the regional grid that services us. So that suppresses the supply that we have. So indications from critics are that these costs are going to go up and ratepayers are going to remain on the hook for them. Also, it will be important how the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio rules on some earlier cases that dealt with whether OVEC charges for earlier years, such as 2018 and 19, were reasonable and prudent. And I should also mention, although we probably don't have time to get into the weeds, but the standard of review for charges under House Bill 6 is arguably more lenient in the utilities' favor.
So 3 utilities already had OVEC subsidies approved before House Bill 6 passed. I guess, why do you think AEP would have put dark money into House Bill 6 then?
The Office of the Ohio Consumers Council made it clear they wanted to challenge the OVEC charges at the Ohio Supreme Court. And so having the statute provide specifically for those subsidies basically would make that argument moot, at least going forward. The argument had been that the charges were not authorized by law, and the earlier decisions of the Public Utilities Commission also might have supported a finding that allowing those charges for the old OVEC plants was arbitrary and capricious. And I say that because initially, when AEP tried to get these subsidies back in 2013 and 14 and 15, around that time frame, PUCO initially said, well, you can put a placeholder rider down, but right now it looks like you're going to lose more money than you're going to make from it. And they had a similar decision for Duke Energy, Ohio. So, you know, if you've got the switcheroo and it's not really explained well, that's what lawyers call arbitrary.
And that, I mean, that leads me to, you know, the other utilities that continue to benefit from the coal plant provisions.
Correct. And that inures directly to AEP Ohio, which has about a 43% equity interest for the whole corporation in OVEC. So having its Ohio shares covered is for it a good thing. But you also have AES Ohio and Duke Energy Ohio having a share in it. First Energy had a share in it, but there were some weird machinations when First Energy Solutions went through bankruptcy. But the upshoot is that House Bill 6 requires First Energy utility customers to be on the hook for shares of the OVEC costs as well. And those kind of get remitted to the other three utility companies, which then send them on to OVEC. And you know, the spokesperson for OVEC happens to also be a spokesperson for AEP Ohio. And he says, well, we don't pay that much attention how much ratepayers are paying because we just get the money. So anyway, that's the short answer to your question.
You know, you mentioned earlier that our campaign finance laws do not do public integrity any favors by allowing for dark money. We know that campaign finance laws have not changed in the state, even with this trial. And this brings up accountability. Dave, Kathy, I want to bring us all together now to talk about what is being done or not done to hold people accountable.
Well, AEP has gotten a couple of subpoenas from the Securities and Exchange Commission. And basically, if it misrepresents things to its shareholders in public filings, that's against the law. So there were these two subpoenas for a lot of documents. And some company officials gave testimony, but AEP Ohio won't tell us who those people were. Another thing that's going on is there have been a couple of shareholder lawsuits where shareholders basically bring a lawsuit in the name of the corporation. They don't benefit themselves other than getting their lawyers' fees paid. But the point is to get the wrongdoers or the alleged wrongdoers to disgorge amounts to the company and make it whole for any alleged wrongdoing. Those cases are on appeal right now. There have been a couple of dismissals. One in New York said, oh, there's already a case in Ohio, so we'll defer to them. And then the judge in Ohio said, well, you haven't shown that it was futile to make a demand on the corporation itself. So therefore, we're just gonna, deny this. That's been appealed, and based on the information Dave went through, I expect they will be arguing in the appeal that there was good reason to show that people knew or should have known or should have asked questions about where roughly $1 million was going of the company's money. Dave, do you want to expand?
Yeah, absolutely. Could you go to the next slide? I just wanted to compare sort of the limited accountability for AEP to what First Energy is facing for repercussions. They were charged criminally and then entered into an agreement with prosecutors in which they paid a $230 million penalty and admitted to wrongdoing in connection with the householder racketeering scheme. And then what sort of ballooned out of the federal investigation have been other investigations by the SEC, but then also a number of federal and state agencies involved in utility regulation. So these monopoly utilities that are regulated are kind of unique because states in particular will give them what's called a service territory, where they say, okay, you know, AEP or First Energy, this is your service territory. You control the electricity, distribution of electricity to all of the customers within it. And then as a trade-off, these public utility commissions regulate the rates and other charges that these utilities get to charge ratepayers. So what was found in the case of First Energy by federal regulators and also in multiple states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland is that some of the costs of these House Bill 6 bribe payments found their way into the utility rates of ratepayers of First Energy utilities in other states and in Ohio. So not every day that you dig so deep into these kind of obscure regulatory proceedings that you start to find weird things like, you know, bribe payments in Ohio popping up in the electric rates of utility customers in Maryland or New Jersey, or even weird things like costs associated with payments like the Cleveland Browns popping up in Maryland. But that's what we've been seeing happen here. So very much seems like there's kind of some broader financial fraud issues at play here. And, you know, whether those are further pursued and held accountable, like the criminal case against Householder, we'll have to see and continue to follow that. But pretty notable the lack of accountability for AEP so far. But that said, a lot of these investigations are ongoing, and with all the new details that have emerged from the Householder trial earlier this year about AEP, we may see some stepped out accountability there.
And there's also those ratepayer lawsuits.
Oh, yes, that's true. First Energy agreed to pay $39 million, and then Energy Harbor, its former subsidiary, agreed to pay $10 million to settle a class action lawsuit by ratepayers in Ohio over the House Bill 6 scheme. And then we haven't seen anything similar with AEP yet. But I would imagine that a lot of class action attorneys are taking a close look at all the new details that emerge on the case. And, you know, they're smart people. So they would know what laws can be applied there. And then I would just also note that in terms of internal accountability, First Energy has at least fired its former CEO, Chuck Jones, and a number of lobbyists who were most intimately involved in this bribery scheme. And you can compare that to AEP's response, which has generally been publicly, oh, you know, we took a look after all these arrests. Things look good here. Have a nice day. So it's kind of a pathetic lack of, you know, responsibility on the part of AEP.
So I think one of the big questions that I hear all the time, and I'm sure each of you hear all the time, is Chuck Jones was not brought in for this trial. Where are these other big names that we keep hearing about? Why have no other individuals or companies been charged?
I'll take that. Essentially, the argument is that the investigation is still ongoing. However, it's been almost 3 years since the first arrests were made. First Energy has admitted that a couple of former executives were involved. It's admitted that it paid money to a company linked to the former head of the Public Utilities Commission. So there are people asking, why aren't these cases brought, and when may these cases be brought? I should mention that those former executives and the former PUCO chair all deny liability. So as far as they're concerned, there are allegations, but they say they are not liable. We also see them saying that they admit that they're in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors. In one recent opinion that came out this past month, one of the federal magistrates said, yeah, okay, these, Jones and Dowling may be in the federal prosecutors' crosshairs, but that doesn't mean they get the privilege of evading discovery, so they've got to sit for depositions. A deposition is questioning somebody under oath with their lawyer present, so it's kind of like, getting a peek at what someone's likely to say. That being said, even if they show up for depositions, I would expect them to be claiming the Fifth Amendment in a variety of instances. Fifth Amendment is the constitutional protection against incriminating yourself. And, we're just going to have to wait and see. There is a state lawsuit that named some of the federal defendants, including Householder and Borges, First Energy and First Energy Solutions, and then a couple of their executives and the former PUCO chair are defendants in that case. Again, they can claim the Fifth Amendment. And it should also be noted, nobody from American Electric Power has been named in that case. As Dave noted, AEP continues to say that it did not do anything illegal.
So we have some questions from the audience. There's a lot of really good ones. I'm going to keep them semi-related at first. We have a lot that are related, and then some others branch out still about House Bill 6 and the scandal. The first one we're going to take is from Eric. It says, what, if anything, can be done to limit the Ohio PUCO regulated utilities from making large contributions to dark money groups?
I actually did a story about this within the last month or so. There are a number of things that can be done. One is to have periodic reporting of all political, charitable, and advertising expenses, just as a matter of routine. You've had the Supreme Court say states can't require that of donations to every sort of dark money group. But in this case, you're dealing with a relatively small number of companies who get a monopoly from the state. So critics say there's a very good argument for doing that. Another thing that could be done would be to speed up some of the regulatory investigations that are going on. The PUCO chair currently has deferred twice to letting the federal lawsuit move ahead, but the Office of the Ohio Consumers Counsel has pointed out, hey, that case has already been tried, and ratepayers deserve to know what happened with their money. There are also groups that want to revoke corporate charters for some of the utilities. And there are also groups that want to reform how settlements can be approved before the Public Utilities Commission, because it appears there can be a lot of side deals made to benefit one party or another at the expense of other ratepayers. Dave, did I miss any big ones?
Nope, I think that pretty much covered it all. I think one thing you briefly mentioned would just be that there are other states that have recently adopted new laws geared towards utilities specifically, and saying any entity that engages in like political influence activity or lobbying or electioneering, you can't use ratepayer money to fund that group. So that's certainly another route that lawmakers in Ohio could take. Granted, it might mean that they lose some of the money that they've traditionally gotten from utilities through weird outlets.
So are there any other options for Ohioans other than AEP or First Energy?
For distribution, you're pretty much stuck. For generation, you may have the option of going with a competitive service provider or a community aggregator. So, for example, up in the Cleveland area, NOPEC, the Northeast Ohio, I'm forgetting what all the letters stand for, but NOPEC is an aggregator for about 127 different municipalities, and they do bulk buying power. So their generation supply costs for consumers for the second half of this year are going to be less than First Energy's. And if you might be an OPEC customer, you should have gotten a letter within the last month to 6 weeks telling you that you could do that. And to opt in, you had to do nothing.
I would just add that not AEP or First Energy specific, but since you can shop for your power generation in Ohio, that would be one way you may be able to avoid Energy Harbor, which is the company formerly known as First Energy Solutions that was involved in the bribery scheme. So you should certainly check and make sure that you're not a customer of them. And they're also a power aggregator for a lot of local communities in Ohio. So it might be also worth looking into whether your town is doing business with Energy Harbor as an aggregator.
And we have a question from Sandy, who says and asks, what should the PUCO be doing to make sure their current proposed rate hikes are not linked to bribes? If you've been hearing about, your rate going up, a lot of them are going to be increasing starting in June. What do the experts recommend that customers do to get an answer to that kind of question? Are these going to be linked to bribes? And how do we know if they are?
One issue that I've heard, and put aside the generation charge, so I'm only talking about the distribution charge right now, which includes both distribution and also a whole bunch of riders that are hidden charges that you get stuck with on your bill, such as the OVEC charges. But there's some other charges that have been involved in some controversies related to House Bill 6. So I've had critics tell me that when First Energy wants to extend and revise a delivery capital recovery rider called Rider DCR, that they want the utility company to have to wait until regulators finally get around to deciding an earlier case involving that charge, where an audit found roughly 1/4 of the charges were improper. And those charges included some money that apparently went to Tony George, whom First Energy executives described as having facilitated some meetings. There are no criminal charges that have been brought against Mr. George. Dave, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I would add, I think the forthcoming increase in utility bills are tied to electricity auctions that are managed by the PUCO, and they establish what First Energy and AEP and other regulated utilities can charge if you don't opt to shop and buy your electricity generation from someone else. So certainly it's interesting that the federal investigation is continuing and has expanded to include the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, not just House Bill 6, but I don't think we really know what will come of that yet. And then the other thing to keep in mind in terms of those other charges on your electricity bills that keep it pretty high, regardless of what the actual rate for electricity is. Keep in mind that First Energy and other utilities like AEP for a number of years had fought to roll back Ohio's energy efficiency requirements, which basically required utilities to maintain and help fund energy efficiency programs that were delivering net savings to their ratepayers. So among these myriad charges that get tacked onto your utility bills, of course, what House Bill 6 did as a result of a lot of this dark money flowing around was eliminate the one charge that ultimately saves you money by helping you, make your home more efficient electricity wise in the long run. And all of those other myriad charges stayed on there because they're profitable and the utilities like them.
Right. And also, going back, prior to the last decade when AEP and First Energy were looking for subsidies or bailouts or whatever you want to call them, with respect to other utilities, there had been, at least one instance of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio telling a utility company, a gas utility in that case, that they needed to change their management because if the management was ineffective, they wanted somebody who would be brought in who could actually run the company as a business. And, that might be a way of sort of punishing utilities, it's been suggested, if they get involved in alleged wrongdoing.
And we have some questions. We're going to wrap it up in a little bit, but we have some questions about specific groups and individuals. So the first question is for Kathiann. What was Joanne Davidson's role? Her name was on a slide of yours.
She was one of the heads of Empowering Ohio's Economy, if I remember correctly, and had been involved with that group. And one of the things that struck me when I was doing the early work before any arrests was, not only was First Energy and First Energy Solutions kind of central to what was going on, but you also had a lot of involvement by some high up folks in the Republican Party. And again, I believe, I would have to double check, but I believe Ms. Davidson had a link to Empowering Ohio's Economy. And there also were people connected with a particular law firm that showed up as lobbyists for First Energy Solutions, as incorporating Generation Now and one or two of the other dark money groups, and being a lawyer for a political action committee that got money from one of the dark money groups. And that same law firm also had somebody that was a big cheerleader for House Bill 6. So, there were these recurring themes that came up.
And
There's
Dave.
also, oh yes, go ahead.
No, you
Oh
were
yeah.
on.
I didn't know if there was another question. There was one piece of evidence that was presented by prosecutors. It was basically a spreadsheet and tracker used by the householder team early on to say, okay, here's the funders, corporations and donors who are quote unquote on the farm with Larry Householder. And then there was another category called quasi on the farm, and First Energy was labeled clearly, on the farm. AEP fell under the quasi on the farm category, but then in parentheses it said Joanne on the farm, company lobbyist on the farm. So kind of one of those like little funny anecdotes from the trial that raises more questions about the householder team's close relationships with some of these individuals.
Talking about the relationships, you did a story a couple weeks back once the exhibits were available for the public to get. Has there been any fallout from the AFL-CIO and their relationship with Generation Now and Larry Householder?
I think the initial fallout was that they were subpoenaed and their documents were included in the evidence presented by prosecutors. And then during the trial, you may recall that Tim Berga of AFL-CIO Ohio appeared like he might testify. He was actually going to be called by householder's side, but then said he didn't want to do it, and then kind of said he would, but then he wasn't called. So he's certainly still out there in the same job and AFL-CIO is still out there doing similar things, but I think the union support of the bill was largely tied to the fact that money was going to go to power plants that did employ, union workers. And clearly things went too far in terms of AFL-CIO Ohio becoming not just, its own entity working to protect the rights of the workers that it represents, but also becoming almost like an advertising agency that dark money from First Energy passed through to run ads supporting House Bill 6.
And my last question before we send it back to Kathiann, and then I guess back to me, but my last question is why, and this is actually from a listener, why are these lawyers and these lobbyists not getting reprimanded for the use of 501c4s and collusion is what the question asker said. And then another person asked, why aren't these lawyers losing their licenses over this kind of behavior?
I'll take a stab at that. First of all, the Ohio State Bar Association treats different ethical charges somewhat confidentially, unless and until there is an adverse finding. So we honestly do not know whether there have been efforts to hold certain lawyers accountable. Another factor that comes up is that as a matter of legal ethics, a lawyer's job is to zealously represent a client within the bounds of the law. So there can be an argument that its strength can vary in terms of how strong it is, but there can be an argument that the lawyer was advising a client to do what current regulations relating to dark money allow them to do. If there was a breach of the wall that's supposed to exist between your candidate on the one hand and the dark money group on the other hand, if there was a breach and they were actually really buddy-buddy and things that were illegal were going on, the lawyer may be able to argue that they did not necessarily know them. So just because somebody acted as an attorney does not mean there was a breach of ethics.
Very good. I think you answered that really well. Now, going back to Kathiann, this slide that you see, transparency is the key. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but there's nobody better to talk about, good government than Kathiann. So, Kathiann.
So I just wanted to highlight that we always need to have a vision of better. Right now we've gone through, the House Bill 6 scandal and the householder trial and the Borges trial. And you go through and you think about all of these different dark groups, but we can have a vision of creating greater transparency. And so many of you participated in forums that we've done in the past. And this image was actually created in 2020. And it was the idea of how can we create greater transparency so that we can actually stop being ripped off? Unless we actually change things, unless we create greater transparency so that we can shine a light on dark money, this is just going to happen again and again and again. And so with that, I want us all to leave with a plan of action. One, we're going to follow up with an email so that you have all of the links and you have the slides and you have a recording. But I want to encourage people, to write an email, call for greater transparency. I also want to encourage you to look over it's like a good toolkit that the Sierra Club created, because of course, all of this comes down to the ratepayers. It comes down to us each paying a little bit more to subsidize these coal plants, and we deserve better. And then because we're very close to this August special election. And many of you won't know this, but when we passed the congressional redistricting reform in 2018, Karen Kessler said, "What is it you plan to do now?" And I was like, well, we're gonna have to get, through the map making, we're gonna have to see how things go. Implementation is hard. But I said, and then what I want to do is dark money. And what I imagined is that we're not going to be able necessarily to get the state legislature to do the right thing when it comes to money in politics, that we would have to do a citizen initiative. And so as we think about, this attack on this right that we have had for a long time, yes, people are thinking about, well, how does this impact reproductive rights? Or maybe they're thinking, how does this impact redistricting reform? But there are a lot of good democracy, fundamental reforms that are threatened by not having the ease to the ballot that we have right now. And it's still so incredibly hard to do a citizen initiative. And so I encourage you, check out the campaign site, and then please check your voter registration. And remember that we have new rules for voting. So we need our voter ID when we go to vote in person now. And I just wanted to say a big thank you for all of you joining us. A big thank you to Kathy, and a big thank you to Dave and to Morgan. And then Morgan, I'll let you take us out of here.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Although Larry Householder has been convicted and no longer sits in the speaker's chair, many people that he surrounded himself with are still at the State House, whether they're current lawmakers or if they're in leadership staff or they're lobbyists. You may not know that several of AEP's current lobbyists have been cited in court documents as pivotal players supporting Householder. This is why it's important to learn what's going on in your government. So thank you all for being here. The best ways that we can learn what's going on is to support local and state news. Journalists are able to shine a light on corruption, and it's more important now than ever, especially with this huge corruption trial that we just had, to really focus in on what our lawmakers are doing. I know a lot of what you've heard today is very complicated, which is why we're going to be sending out slides as well as a link to this forum. And you will also get each of the panelists' information. You can follow us online on our social media where we post our stories and we just discuss things going on, post records, all of that. So you can also ask questions to us at any time or share information if you have things that you want us to check out. I hope everybody has a lovely evening, and thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.